Hey everybody, my name's Gabe, and if I hated you, you would know. Hey, welcome to the latest episode. Excuse me, got something in my throat for some reason. So today's episode, I'm actually probably not going to do like a whole, just random thought. It'll be entwined a little bit with talking about Ken Burns' new 12-hour documentary about the American Revolution that I just wrapped up and is super fascinating. Then I'm going to talk about a graphic novel called Palestine by Joe Sacco that I think is really indicative of kind of the situation that's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, Palestine, Israel, and all of that mess. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then wrap up the episode with an interview with Evette Ewing, who is a dialectical behavioral therapist, works with people that have substance abuse problems largely within the judicial system. It's a really, really interesting conversation that, because this camera likes to auto-zoom sometimes, no one is going to accuse me of being a cinematographer for. So I'll have to figure that out, and I think I have to clean up some of the audio too. But that's neither here nor there. That is my problem, not yours. So anyway, just kind of moving on. So I think I mentioned it briefly in one of the other episodes that I had seen that Ken Burns was on Meet the Press, right, for an hour-long interview. And with our current political climate, my immediate thought was, oh, yeah, the dude that made the Civil War documentary on Meet the Press, that's probably not a good sign. But it turns out it had very little to do with that and everything to do with having a new PBS documentary on the American Revolution. It's 6 2-hour-long episodes, so it's 12 hours long. It's very in-depth, it's very thorough, it's very interesting. It's different from, some of the other documentaries that he's been able to do, because much of the representations that we have of the Revolutionary War are paintings as opposed to photographs. So the I guess the reality of it, the journalistic side of it, all art, photography is the same way, right? Photography tells certain stories, sends certain messages, especially in the past as photography was developing, because it was such a long process that you actually had to set things up to prepare it, very much like you would a still life painting. So I think more of the point and shoot style of photojournalism that we have today can grasp a moment of reality a little bit better than maybe, photography in the 1800s did, but certainly better than a painting would, because a painting is always, very, very rarely do you have journalistic oil paintings, right? People are definitely trying to send a message with art, in the 1700s. So you're dealing with these aggrandized visions of people, plus a lot of maps, right? Because there's a lot of battles and understanding the movement of people. But then they also created a lot of art that illustrated the moments in a looser kind of fashion than the more structured kind of oil paintings that you would have seen in the past. And they also did a lot of kind of B-roll footage of events happening, walking through swamps, traveling through woods, things like that, that really brought it to life. So as an experience, as a piece of, entertainment media, it was very good. They found a way to manage the limited resources that they have to present the subject matter, right? With the Civil War, there's thousands and thousands of photographs, with say the Vietnam documentary or the baseball documentary that they did, there's like video footage, right, that they can splice in that really brings a lot of those things to life. But so being able to use art and film and map making and, art history in combination to like tell the story, I think was very, very effective. The story of it, and just like any documentary film, just like any piece of media that we engage with, there is a message behind it, right? Ken Burns does have a motivation for what he's making, and it isn't just purely this is historic, fact, right? Because that's not how we interact with history, right? Like you probably have a few key dates memorized in your brain from your time in elementary and high school, but the reality is you understand a story of history a lot more than you understand like when and where things happened. So like if you think back to your own life, you may not be able to tell me the exact specific date that an important event in your high school happened. Like me, I was in a band. So I remember the first time we practiced in my friend's barn, right? I don't know exactly when that happened, and maybe one of them does, but I remember the moment, right? Like the feel of it, the sounds, just who was there, those kinds of things. We understand history more as stories than we do as like facts and figures. And every story comes with a theme, right? Otherwise, it's not an interesting story. If I just go from A to B and there's no reason to go from A to B, then why would I care? And what Kim Burns really cares about in this is understanding that the words and ideas that are being presented are not only good and virtuous and powerful, but that they fall short because of the people that are using them and because of the structures that are already in place. And on top of it, because the people that are saying the words aren't prepared to fully act on the words. That's not failure, right? It's progress. Like it's exactly what progress looks like. So when we think about like this kind of, they talk about the arc of history, the broad sweeping arc of history. It's a constant state of us attempting to refine systems to make more people rather than less people comfortable and happy, right? We are not regularly perfecting that. As a matter of fact, I don't think anywhere has perfected that. But we are regularly moving in a positive direction. There may have been times in history that had pockets of intense peace, but the way we settled conflict 300 years ago was a lot more regularly murder than it is now, right? We do have judicial systems. We do have things in place that make it better. Does it make it perfect? No, but it makes it better. So seeing the roots of the country kind of through this lens of evolving to be better, you can then kind of keep stepping forward and see like the incremental movements that our country has attempted to make. The women's right to vote, the civil rights movement for Black people, the civil rights movement for Hispanic people, the civil rights movement for disabled people, and then now for the LGBTQ community and others, right? Like we are currently talking about what does it mean to like be a United States citizen? What does it mean to, like, is birthright citizenship right or wrong? There are those arguments and things that we thought we had moved past. Like, there's a segment of society trying to push backwards, right, to a better time. But there wasn't a better time, right? Like, it was always worse in the past. It may not have been worse for your particular people, but it was worse for a lot of people, right? You know, that's why we celebrate the civil rights movement. That's why we celebrate places like, you know, the Stonewall Inn. That's why we celebrate people like, you know, Cesar Chavez, right? So what keeps us going forward, right? Like, what keeps us, like, what didn't stop, you know, what didn't stop that progress? You know, because slavery didn't stop it. And yeah, we had a violent conflict over that, right? Black people being enfranchised didn't stop it. But there was pretty violent conflict over that. Gay rights didn't stop it. But there's been violent conflict over that. And we're facing it again, where we're literally trying to define, what does it mean to be a citizen of this country, right? And there is currently violent conflict over that. And probably will continue to be, right? So here's what I would say. Being a citizen is a lot more about how you view the people in close proximity to you than how you view the big picture, right? What it means to be a citizen is to be a part of a community, right? The root of the word that we get from, you know, that we use for civics as well, has to do with cities specifically, and not just in the sense of like the cluster of buildings, but in the sense of a community, right? So what pushes us to be the more perfect union, right? What pushes us? There is that conflict that when it reaches its peak, people see their neighbor as just another person. And that comes not from the top down, but from seeing at the bottom up, right? How do I see the people that I don't agree with and dislike? How do I see them? Are they my enemy? Are they evil? Are they meant to be eradicated? Or are they also just struggling to survive? Are they just another citizen, right? So it's not just how I view my neighbors, but it's also how I engage them. How can I engage somebody that I don't like, that I disagree with? I don't know. How do I fix that? I gotta go out. I gotta have conversations. I gotta figure it out, right? How do I get better at that? Well, I gotta better myself, right? I don't want to be the person, you know, on the Daily Show saying the most boneheaded thing on the face of the earth. I need to educate myself. I need to better myself. And that is what Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, right? So we're entitled to three things as citizens of this country. Life, right? You are not allowed to kill me. You don't get to make that choice. I frankly don't think the state should be allowed to make that choice either, whether it be through police violence or planned execution. You're allowed liberty. I can say and do and be who I want. Is that free from like regulation? No. That's not a violation of my liberty. That's an agreement that I'm going to be willing to sacrifice something to make sure that other people aren't hurt, right? Is it really confining to say you're not allowed to punch your brother in the face? No. It's just the way we manage conflict. It's what prevents us from being the loyalists and the rebels murdering each other in their homes over political disagreement, right? That's how we solve those problems, is by managing our society through rules and saying, this is what you are allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do. And when we let people in different classes slide by on those rules, then of course it's a free-for-all, right? And it creates those conflicts. But the last thing that we're entitled to is this pursuit of happiness, right? And when we look at Jefferson's writings, a lot of the time that meant like continuing to develop yourself, self-education, learning, reading, expanding, growing. What does all that look like? What is all that about? It's about going out and interacting with the thing that you're afraid of, that you don't understand, that you're mad at, and trying to find the space where you can resolve the conflict to make a better society. Like, that's what being a citizen is. So if I need to do it, so do all of us, but I can't do it blind. So I read, I watch smarter people than me talk. I talk with people that are smarter than me to learn more, right? This video zine can be a model for you, right? You don't have to record it. You can just sit down with people you don't understand and ask them questions. Let them talk. Listen and learn. I think if we all took steps to do stuff like that, we all might end up being better citizens. And a lot of the problems that we think we have would probably start to melt away, because we can find ways to let women vote. We can find ways to let black people not be slaves. We can find ways to let immigrants move to this country and create new lives. We've managed all of those things. Why can't we manage this one? Yeah, there'll be conflict, but, just keep stepping forward. Yeah, all right. I'm going to move on to the next thing. So, yeah, be back in a second. All right, welcome back. I'm going to talk about a book, another book, because I love books. This one is a graphic novel. It's called Palestine. It's by a guy named Joe Sacco. Joe Sacco is kind of, I think, fairly unique in the world of sequential art, comic books, graphic novels, however you want to think of it, in the sense that he's like the photojournalist of comic books, right? He goes to places, he takes pictures, he makes notes, just like a photojournalist would, but then he transmits them into comics, right? So it's a really cool way of seeing the world. I think it's a very artistically intentional way of seeing the world. I think it can create like a really powerful message and really put people in a very it can put people in the space, right? What burrito? Sorry. It's my cat meowing like crazy. But it can put people in the space where they are there with him, right? Because a lot of the time he draws himself into the panels, which it gives a very tactile sensibility to it. This book obviously is about Palestine, right? It takes place on a visit that he does to the West Bank and Gaza in the early 90s. I want to say 92 92 to 93. And just the experience that he had effectively trying to see what the results of like the first Intifada were, the way the situation was on the ground, what the, refugee camps were like, those sorts of things, right? So it's a very in-depth and at times harrowing and at times very intense and sometimes very funny look at this situation in a very human way, right? So as I go forward, I think it's very important for me to say what is happening in Gaza, in Israel, is genocide, right? By definition, like forcing people out of their land is genocide, in the same way that we think of the native people of the United States being pushed out of their land and that we live on stolen land. Like, that is the same kind of genocide being perpetuated against the Palestinian people. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like, that's just the way that word works. If you are willing to delude yourself into thinking that is wrong, I would just reiterate that I take complaints in the comments, but ad hominems and just, throw away "you're wrong, you're stupid" comments don't do me any good. I need to see, right? Like, you need to send me reports or news or something. And I read stuff, and I read stuff from all sides, but my opinions are strong because I base them in stuff that I have interacted with, not just, what a talking head tells me. I read books and stuff. So please, if you want to challenge me, really challenge me. I'd love it. I'd love it. Honestly, I'd love to sit and have the conversation too. So, I think it's important to also clarify one piece of terminology, and I won't touch on it too in depth, even while talking about the book, because I think that the overarching sensibility is expressed more through action than through words, right? In what happens in the pages, right? But there is a sensibility that saying the Zionist movement is the same as like saying people are Jewish, and that somehow criticizing the Zionist movement is anti-Semitic seems like a big misnomer to me. In much the same way that you would say, like the Knights of Columbus equals Christianity, right? Like, you wouldn't make that statement that like a political, and the Knights of Columbus is a bad example because it's a fraternal organization, but just like a political party is not a religion. Well, depending, like if you listen to the last interview, but in general, political parties are not religions, and nor are they ethnicities, right? So somebody isn't necessarily Jewish by religion. A lot of people are Jewish by ethnicity. And to say that, for example, being Republican means you're white, or being white means you're Republican, those are wrong statements, right? So being Jewish doesn't mean you're a Zionist. And probably in a lot of ways, being a Zionist doesn't always exemplify being Jewish, right? So those are like kind of high-minded concepts to keep in mind if the word Zionist comes up. It has nothing to do really with the religion or the ethnicity, and everything to do with the political thought behind it and the political motivations behind it. So with that said, let me talk about it a little bit. I knew going into this that I didn't know as much about the subject as I would like, right? I have seen protests. I have heard people passionately talk. I have read, news reports about horrible things going on. I had a vague understanding of, this transition post World War II to create a homeland for the Jewish people, almost as like uh, a reparation for the Holocaust, which, I mean, right? Makes sense. You know, what a nightmare, what a tragedy for a people to go through, right? But those kind of traumatic situations can catalyze people into like a lot of different directions, right? You know, going through a trauma does not necessarily make like the healthiest decision makers. It doesn't necessarily make the best people. You know, and when we're talking about like this kind of situation and the rise of like this Zionist movement, there clearly is a lot of bitterness, right? Bitterness at being abused, you know, people that find their ways out of abusive relationships aren't always happy people, you know, they don't always let go and heal. I can't imagine for an entire society, right? Like an entire culture of people. Like I can't imagine. I can't hold on to that thought. And I know the way I feel would make me very angry. I would have a difficult time forgiving if I knew my whole family had been murdered or tortured or, you know, just the brutality is unreal, right? Like it's impossible to divorce this rise in an aggressive and angry and bitter form of religion. It's impossible to not sympathize in so many ways because of this monumental tragedy that had happened to them. That doesn't make the responses right? So there's two quotes that I found just really hard because I had never really interacted with this before, right? That come directly from this kind of Zionist movement. Not kind of, it's what it is. So, there is a quote from the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, where he said, a Palestinian, quote, is equally at ease, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, or a variety of places, right? So there's this mentality that the people of Palestine would be comfortable anywhere else, right? They're in the region, that they don't have like a true tie to the land, right? That they could be comfortable anywhere else. So he had no illusions about spiriting or inducing the Palestinians away. In each attack, quote, in each attack, he wrote, quote, a decisive blow should be struck, resulting in the destruction of homes and the expulsion of the population. When that was basically accomplished, he told an advisor, quote, Palestinian Arabs have only one role left, to flee. So the intention is to make people flee their homes, to destroy their homes, to create a place where it's untenable to live, right? I'm sorry this is kind of slow, but I think it's important for me to find the quotes. And it's a very dense piece of page that I will probably put in here as like kind of a video clip. So, Prime Minister Golda Meir said, it was not, quote, it was not as though there was a Palestinian people considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist. So there's this dismissive notion, right, that these people can be comfortable anywhere else. Why not just leave? You aren't even really Palestinian, so why are you even here? But that's not like the reality on the ground, right? Like there are people that have lived there for generations and generations, just like the native people in our country. living off of the land, creating economies and resources, politics, structures, systems, everything, right? Those people had lived there. That was their home. And to be pushed off creates this situation where people are understandably angry, right? And people are understandably fighting back in the same way that the native people in our country did, in the same way that we would if an invading force tried to take our homes from us, right? So these conflicts are like ongoing because genocide is hard if there's not a place to go to, right? So the way the United States accomplished the genocide of the native people was to just keep pushing west until they could force them into confined spaces. And that push west felt endless in the 1800s, right? And a push south, a push north can continue to make that movement happen. Israel's tiny, and it is surrounded by countries that don't want a new population pushed into them, that do have controls on their borders and their spaces. So a population that's being pushed against a wall responds, right? There's an added layer to this that I think I really didn't fully understand. At one point, he talks with some women about the importance of wearing the hijab. And he asks them, so do they feel obligated to wear it? No, I've got it all wrong. On the contrary. And then they say, I want to believe strongly enough to wear the hijab always. Did I catch that right? Not just in the streets. I want to really believe in wearing it. And he says, I can tell you that throws me for a loop, and I see the gulf between us. I realize that I've forgotten what it's like to have faith. I've forgotten what it's like to want to have faith. I'm in a very similar position mentally, right? Where I hear arguments for and against what's happening. And so many of them are based on religions that people have a tenuous grasp of a lot of the time. I work with somebody who once claimed to me that the Jews, as she said it, right, not really, embracing the nuance of like the politics of like the situation, that it's not Jewish people that lay claim to the land, but like a government that lays claim to the state of Israel in the name of a political movement that was fostered by, Europeans and Americans post World War II, right? But she says, the Jewish people have claim to this land because of biblical passages, right? Well, many Palestinians would have similar claims to land based in sacred writings as well, right? So, if there was a massive rise in ancient, Mesopotamian civilizations, someone else could lay an even more ancient claim to the land, right? But that ignores like real people in deference to religion and faith. And I have a hard time interfacing with that, right? I have a hard time making that connection anymore because I became so disillusioned with that. And I don't think I'm in a minority anymore. I think there's a lot of people that have reimagined and rethought what faith and blind belief in religious systems really means. But that's not true in a lot of other places, right? Where faith is like fundamental to your way of life. There is a book called The First Ghost by a guy named Irving Finkel. And if you listen to it as an audiobook, you will definitely want to speed it up to 2x speed, because he is a very slow talker, because he is a very old man. But in it, he talks about how it's very difficult for us to understand that the ghosts that these people are referring to, the spells that they're casting, the demons that they're afraid of, are real to them, right? Things that we dismiss as superstition, right? Like, I believe even most people of faith would dismiss what they're saying as superstition. Like the ghost of somebody that you irritated hanging out too long, so you like throw some salt and vinegar on the floor and that like cures ghosts, right? Or this notion that, we need to pay someone to unhaunt our house. I mean, when I think about shows like Ghost Adventures and stuff, though, I guess the reality is that there's plenty of people that still believe that kind of stuff. But I think most people would kind of let go of it and dismiss it as maybe not necessarily being fully real, or they've created a scientific justification for it, like in their own mind, right? So, and that's fine. But like it's real to you. If you believe in ghosts, they're real, right? If you don't have that, but ignore that it's someone else's reality, like you can't work together. You can't connect. If both sides are saying we lay ancient claim based on ancient manuscripts to this place, who can resolve it? Right? How do we resolve it? Why haven't we moved away from violence? Right? What's creating that dynamic? And so often that dynamic is rooted in like belief itself. I think that's why I have a hard time like getting it, right? I have a hard time getting why the state of Israel can't manage having a neighbor that just is different. Yeah, there's a lot of history of violence, but there's also like a lot of history of effort in the opposite direction from people in all sides of it. Why not lean into that instead of lean into the other way? And the only thing that I can truly think of is this desire to eradicate the people from a space, right? And that goes so far as to do things like destroy their homes and tear down like olive vineyards that have belonged to people for hundreds of years, right? There's only like a couple more moments that I really wanted to touch on. There is a scene in here where they're going down the street, and I will put this in video too, and a bunch of guys barrel out of the back of a truck. They toss a percussion grenade and then tear gas, and then reinforcements show up. And like people are just kind of milling about in the crowd. Like some people are responding, few people throw rocks, but some people just want to be left alone. And it felt too much like here right now. And that's a little scary to understand that. And knowing that ICE and IDF have trained together makes it even a little more disturbing. I guess the last one I wanted to touch on is this conversation that he has with an elderly gentleman, right? And he brings in a friend, and they're talking about the green line is basically a demarcation line that says like this part is Gaza and Palestine, this part is Israel, right? But that line is extremely arbitrary. So, all right, 1 second. My kid is gonna scream. Really, Cody? I'm doing this stuff. Yeah. Can you please shut the door and stop yelling? It's just the yelling. He needs to pee. Don't worry, I'll cut that part out. I hope I remember. Anyway, he invites a friend over, right? And they're talking about this green line, this arbitrary line that separates Palestine from Israel. Guy sits down, and through translation, this elderly man says, this man, he had land and a house on the other side of the green line. They took it from him. The Israelis have his olive trees now. Ask him if he will ever give up this land. Then he says, if they gave him all the land between here and Pakistan, he wouldn't give up a rock of the land they took from him. I went to a conference this week that was about historic preservation, and there was a keynote speaker that talked a lot about what historic preservation looks like for the Native people of the United States. And one of the things that really grasped me as she was talking about, oh man, so many distractions today. Burrito, shut up. As she was talking about what historic preservation means for the Native people of the United States, and particularly in our region, they had created a big historical context about Native people in Denver, right? And that historical context is like the way it was generated, all of that super fascinating because it's done a different way than it would normally be done when just like going through like a European identification of it, because all of that stuff is written down. All of that stuff is, reported in newspapers. All of that stuff is put in books. But when it comes to the Native population, a lot of that is trapped into like oral histories. It's trapped into having conversations with people and like doing that sort of dialogue to create the context, right? And that's very, very different from typical research. So that aspect of it was super fascinating. But this notion of being ancestrally tied to the land is so powerful. And I don't think many people fully grasp it, right? So I grew up in a fairly rural community that has turned into a fairly urban community. And that transition created a loss of places, right? That in some ways, I understand because I understand growth and economics, and I understand, the need for, new construction as new people move into a region. That all makes sense, right? But the dirt bike track on the giant hill that I used to bomb on my BMX when I was a middle schooler is gone, right? And it's never going to be back. That hurts, right? And that is minuscule, right? That's just a fun thing I did when I was a little kid is gone. But I still feel that, right? That loss. And it sucks. And like when I talk about Greeley's growth, it's an anecdote that comes up a lot. So it meant a lot to me. Imagine if it was your home, right? Or like the orchard that you had lived in your whole life, that you watched your grandpa work and your dad work and that you had worked. The home that you were raised in and also raised your kids in. The places that you had been for, dozens of generations, thousands of years of history, right? That's what the Palestinians were facing. That's what the natives of this continent were facing, right? Are facing. This sense of erasure. They have a place to go, so be gone. This sense of ignored, right? No, we're here. What the hell? That's my home. And then a sense of collective trauma. One of the things that came up in the historical context was the importance of accurately telling the story of the Sand Creek Massacre. I didn't grow up Native, so in my brain, this is a story from a history long gone. If your family has lived in this region for thousands of years, something that happened hundreds of years ago is recent history. And the Palestinians are going through that, right? This loss of identity, of place, of home, of safety, of protection. And for what? Condos, I think, is the new plan, right? Beachside resorts. The Palestinians couldn't have been there for that. The lives of people hindering development. It's just, it's an interesting thing to have watched unfold, but then to interact with a piece of media that says, not only have you been watching it unfold, you've been watching it unfold your entire life. And for your entire life, you have been watching the kind of genocide that you have hated since high school that happened to the natives of this country, happening to another group of people that, frankly, when I was a conservative Christian, I wanted them gone too. And that creates a lot of like complicity and guilt and shame. So, how do I fix it? I mean, I just talk for too long about being a citizen. Interact, learn, dialogue, fucking actually figure out a solution. Talk. Right? I'm not going to solve the Middle East. But I can be part of the ground up in my home. I can stand up for people that are discriminated against here, that share the same religion and beliefs as Palestinian people, and the same religion and beliefs of Israeli people. Because they don't deserve to be attacked for being ethnically Jewish or religiously Jewish or from a Jewish family or married to a Jewish person. In the same way that nobody deserves to get attacked for wearing a hijab or being Muslim, or for the same reason nobody deserves to be attacked because they're wearing a cross. Like, I don't know. It's just such a tricky conundrum. But this book helped me see that a lot of what the people there are facing is not new. It's not unique to this moment. And that if something isn't done about it, it will be just as deeply shameful as the Holocaust, as the genocide of the Native Americans, as the Spanish conquest of the Americas. It might not have the same raw numbers, but, you know, things like Rwanda and Darfur and, you know, the chaos that was happening in Yugoslavia in the 90s, like those things just get so glossed over because they're not as big, but they all are just, it's tragic. It's tragic. And when it's presented right in front of your face and you realize that it's also being done in your name as a part of this country, then yeah, it sucks. It really does. Yeah. So kind of a downer episode. My bad. I'm going to go to the interview that I had with Evette next. And I think it's important to say that this is about that in a lot of ways. It's about how do we communicate with each other? What are better ways to communicate with each other? How do we create compassion, like even around systems that are not designed for it, right? We talk quite a bit about how to create openness when you're forced into a situation, right? How to create a conversation with somebody that needs mental health help, but is forced to get that help by the judicial system. And I think like those kind of moments of like conflicting power, right? I'm literally just here to help you, and I'm sorry that somebody's making you be here, is a tough place to be. So really interesting interview. Again, nobody is ever going to call me a cinematographer. I'm pretty sure you can't see me through the whole interview. I'm pretty sure you can only see my belly, so I'll probably crop that out. And you will also probably recognize that it looks like it's filmed through a potato, because I think I smudged the lens at some point. But whatever. It's not really about what it looks like. It's about what we're talking about. So I'll be back in a little bit. So, hello, welcome back. Obviously, I'm Gabe. Today with me, I have Evette Ewing, or Ewing, as we were joking about earlier. But as you know, I presented before, doing these kind of interviews, like in general, I'm not trying to go in with any kind of like specific like agenda to what we're going to talk about, but I just like talking with interesting people. And your brother said that you're interesting, and I think you're interesting, and he recommended it like 5 times. I was like, you know what, that is a pretty good idea. So the way I start it always is just tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I would say I am often a quiet observer. I work in the mental health field and substance abuse. I'm a counselor, and so I often pay attention just with what I see and hear, and really just, I would say a silent observer, because I'm constantly looking around. I pay attention to things, but I don't always speak to them. But I'm always aware.
So thinking about like what you do professionally, like working in substance abuse counseling, like when you're saying that, like, are you a direct like a one-on-one kind of person, or like the leader of like groups, or like expand on kind of specifically like what your role would be, like what your capacity is at that?
So right now I am actually a director of our Greeley branch. We have a Loveland and Fort Collins office. And with that, I do a lot of the supervision for our newer interns and help them as they're getting licensed. I also facilitate groups. I do actually 2 groups right now, dialectical behavioral therapy groups, which I love. And then I also do some individual counseling as well. I've got because of my role that's shifted, and because for the last 5 years I've done primarily supervision, my groups and counseling has trimmed back. But I do get the opportunity to still work with some clients. I've got one that I worked with for 2 years now that he's just stayed on after it's largely court mandated clients.
Right.
So he stayed on long after his probation requirements were done. And I've got some that are, we have a DUI court treatment program. So I've got a couple that I work with in that.
So, dialectical behavioral, what was the last
Therapy.
one? Therapy. So
DBT.
What does that mean? Just because, like, I don't know. So I'm assuming other people that would be watching wouldn't know.
So I love it. So it does stem from cognitive behavioral therapy, which in short is really looking at how we think about our behaviors, how our thoughts and feelings impact our behaviors. DBT, that was developed by Marshall Linehan, is considered the more compassionate form of cognitive behavioral therapy, in that it's the best way I always describe it to people is that it's that dialectical piece, is that acknowledgement or that awareness that 2 opposing forces can both be true at the same time. I use that with relationships. You can recognize that on one hand, I love this person, and on the other hand, this is not a healthy relationship for me.
Right.
Or with substances, I really want to be clean and sober, and I got to have a drink. So it's both. It's this and that, not this but that.
Right. So when you're thinking of that very specifically, when it comes to like substance like abuse and things like that seems like it's really pivotal, right? Because it's truly like this love-hate dynamic, like in conversation with each other, as dialectical implies. So how, like, what does it look like when you're kind of applying that, that particular like framework to your therapy? Like, how does that express itself, like in a context like one-on-one or with a group? Like, what makes it, I guess, more importantly, what makes it the compassionate thing? Like, what is it about this like conversation that makes it better for people?
Well, I think that there is that idea that it's, again, if you think about that relationship, if I love this person, there's got to be something wrong with me because we're constantly fighting. There's maybe DV charges. We can't get along. But I love that idea of that dialectical piece because I remind people when it's both and. And so I think it takes away the craziness. I'm not so crazy. There's a reason why I have these cravings, for something that has been completely destructive in my life. So you're not crazy. You're not insane. It's both. And so how do we, and I love this part of, it's DBT is broken up to 4 skill modules, and one is mindfulness. And it's part of mindfulness, how we become more mindful is without judgment. And so instead of putting judgment, well, I'm an addict or something wrong with me, it's getting curious. So what's going on that's creating all of this? Where did this come from? Where did this stem from? So I love the idea of getting curious instead of judgmental, whether it's with self or others. And that's a big part of that mindfulness and ties into that compassionate piece.
So it's really interesting to think about, like I'm a huge, I have an anecdote that I don't know if I've talked about it in this space before, but I interact with kids a lot, like on an educational level when it comes to like my job, like teaching kids about history. And like 99% of the time when I say, does anybody have a question, like 15 hands shoot up. Like every kid is curious about some weird thing, It's either about why do you look so much like Steve from Minecraft to like, do people still use like deer brains to make lotion? Like all sorts of weird questions, right? But we dealt with like a cohort of homeschool kids that, like, I think the way they experience education is very different. Like, they're being told, like, this is the answer, like, these are the right things. So when I asked, does anybody have a question, nobody had any questions. Because as an authority figure, like, I was able to just, like, dictate to them, this is what's right. And they just believed it, because that's how they are taught. So you're dealing with, like, this really kind of interesting situation where you're trying to like open people to like this idea of like being mindful, being like curious, being in conversation with like really like disparate parts of like your mental state. But a lot of those people are having to do that because like an authority has like told them they have to. So like how do you like create open spaces for people that are forced to be in your space, right? Like, how do you create a way of saying, this is okay for you to experience, even though, like, you have to experience and you don't really have a choice?
Well, so it goes back to this mindfulness piece. In my clients, they tease me because I always say, and it comes from, again, Marsha Linehan, she talks about it, creating a quality of life worth living. And so I always bring that up. Like, that's what we want to do is create a quality of life worth living. This isn't a quality of life worth living. And if you have to come every Monday night and spend 2 hours with me, that's not, I'm guessing, how you want to spend your night, especially when it's football season. So really part of mindfulness is also, again, how we become more, I guess, aware and taking hold of our mind is that ability to do what works. And so what's effective? And my goal with them is to be effective. If you can take one thing out of group, whether it's, doesn't have to be from me, it can be from somebody else. But instead of showing up and just mindlessly, which is the opposite, right, of not being present and here, if you can show up and fully put your soul into what we're doing and just fully be here, one, it goes by quicker. but also you do what works, what's effective, what's going to be helpful, right, instead of harmful. And this is a space where, if anything, if you have to pay for it, why not get something out of it? And so I think part of that, and I think really I want them to get something out of it. And so I really try to be intentional about, it's over telehealth. So when they come in, acknowledging each one of them, even if I don't know them, welcome, welcome so-and-so. I'm glad you're here. So making them like this, you're a part of something, and everything that's part of DBT too is everything is connected to everything. How I show up is going to impact how they show up. And I think because I'm there and saying, I want this to be effective for you, that seems to have worked. And so I like to do what works. And I think their guard goes down and we can just have a conversation.
What does it's really difficult, I think, for especially like the judicial system and stuff to measure what success really looks like in a situation like that. Somebody that has like a DUI or like a DV charge or something like that. What do you feel success looks like, or like what has it looked like, when you're doing work in these kind of situations?
I love that. So success for me is when they are able to come back each week and say, I really wanted to have a drink, especially when they're transitioning from work release, which is highly structured, and now I'm home for my first week. I really wanted to have a drink. But I did what you've taught us to. And I just allowed myself to just feel it and know that it was there and not, suppress it. And I did something different. When they can come back and say, I'm using this, to me, that's progress. And I've had clients that will relapse and come back. And when they can say that to a group of 15 other people and say, I had a really bad week. I didn't use any of the skills you told me, and I'm only 2 days sober. How amazing, because that's being present and that's just being real. To me, that's progress, because a part of addiction is secrecy and hiding things, so that you can come to a group of us and just say, I screwed up. You guys are all talking about how you used skills in the last week. I didn't.
I did not.
And
yeah.
That's okay. Let's shift to that. What do you need right now? And to me, that's progress.
It's really interesting to think about like the secrecy component of it. Like, how much of a factor do you think, I think societal shame is like incredibly intense. And so like, I really disagree with RFK Jr., right? His ideas seem like total craziness to me, et cetera, et cetera. But when people are like, actively point out he used to do heroin, it's like, well, yeah, but he used to, right? Like, I think he's crazy, like, I don't like his ideas, et cetera, but like this, like, stigmatizing somebody for like their past behavior, like it feels like it's an extra burden to face, like, in those situations. Like, how do you like kind of help people navigate those waters of being able to be open to say something like, I am an addict or I am an alcoholic, but like kind of also bear the burden of like what that means when you go out into like your day-to-day life?
You mean as far as just embracing it, and how do they...
how do you help people like kind of understand how to deal with that? Because that's got to be like a new thing for some people. If you've been hiding for your whole life that you're an alcoholic or that you're an addict or something, and now you're like purposefully like, if I go to my uncle's house and he's like, hey, here's a beer, I have to say, I'm sorry, I have a problem, so I don't drink anymore, right? And that's a new thing. Like, maybe your uncle makes fun of you, you don't drink, what's wrong with you? How do you, I guess, what equipment would you give to somebody who's like facing that kind of like new challenge?
I guess I go back to that values base, and part of what I try to teach them as far as increasing their own self-respect. Part of that is all those, interpersonal effectiveness skills we teach in DBT. But part of that is, what's your value system? What's guiding you now? Because a lot of the values they've had have either been from childhood, from whatever families that maybe weren't their own families, but friends, social system that they carry. So really exploring, so what are your values? What's guiding you? Because ultimately that's going to give you, if you want to say, the courage or be able to set that boundary, because now my recovery or just I really value my life. And so when I think they can identify their values, I think it makes it easier to tie in some boundaries and say, it doesn't matter if you don't agree with me or you don't like that I don't do that anymore. Even if it's the value is freedom. Now you know what it's like to be tied down. You can't go anywhere without permission, but I value my freedom, so I don't want to do this.
So at the very beginning of this, you talked a lot about being just like a quiet observer, right? Like, and imply like a lot of passivity with it, which, as somebody that's known you for quite a while, I don't think I would ever like think of you that way. Like you seem very open with like your thoughts and opinions, but maybe that's just because, of personal interactions before, right? But how does this deep sense of like observation and watching help you like reach like another person, like in these kind of situations? Like, what is it that you're able to like glean just from like watching and listening that allows you to like help somebody maybe understand a better path or like a better like, choice or value system?
Well, this probably sounds corny, but I just love people. And I get emotional saying that. I love people. I value people. And I think sometimes I don't think people feel that. I think, we're hardwired for connection and survival. And I think a lot of people have had to survive through life. I don't think they know what safety feels like. And so I would love to be able to be that person that just locks eyes and just a smile and lets you know you're safe here in my presence, but you can say whatever. I'm not going to judge you or criticize you. You're safe. And I think just that desire, I've worked with teenagers, I've worked with adults, but there's so much brokenness. And I think because people don't feel valued or loved or connection. And so there's the drive to, one, allow people to feel safe and to know that you can feel safe in your own body, your own nervous system. I often teach clients too, or talk to them about, when they're in the judicial system, they don't feel like anything they're doing is rewarded. I can't please anybody. I can't do anything right. And I try to teach them, you have to validate yourself to just know you're making progress. Back to that, how do you know I'm making progress? You show up. So if you just barely got out of bed today and you showed up to group and this is the first interaction you're having, yay. Like you got up today. Like that, just acknowledge yourself. Who cares if you don't get anything out of this group? You showed up and that's one less group you have to do. I just want people to feel heard and seen and that their life has some value to it.
You mentioned like the interconnectedness and like being able to connect with people. Like I think there's like a really distinct sensibility like in our country, and I think it's like really hard baked into like just the foundation of the country and everything, that like the individual is like the most important component of like any situation, right? Like, we believe in like single democracy and like boards and like having to your individual voice. Do you think that sometimes we lean so hard into that we forget like how important it is to like have like connections, to have a support system of any kind? Like, because like you said, so many people go through life just trying to survive like on their own. Like I guess like, what do you think would be the most helpful for people like when it comes to like connecting? Like I don't know, I'm not fully sure what I'm trying to get at, but I guess talk a little bit more about how important it is to be connected to other people.
Well, and I think it starts from, obviously very young. I think of, and I was listening to this, it was just training, but I thought it was so interesting. He was talking about how in some countries, they put a lot of time and energy even to childcare, early childcare, right? And there's support and communities have support, and they have just overall, these countries have less crime and incarceration than compared to the States. And there's, it's hard to find childcare. So early on, you have a lot of where there's 2-parent homes have to work. And you see that all the time. I love listening to like crimes stuff.
Right.
Which
doesn't everybody?
And so, but you hear all these things of, neglect and kids that aren't home, and there's abuse in child care places, and we have this high incarceration. So I think from a very young age, really letting people feel, just kids, knowing that sense of safety, that when I come home, there's consistency. Somebody's always there. Even when I'm upset, I know there's consistent, I know I'm going to be loved. But I'm just thinking, you tie in all of the things again, people working so hard, and then there's addiction, and then there is abandonment. And then you have, another layer of trauma, and then with parents who don't know how to provide nurture and love because they don't have that. So, there's just all these things. So I think being able to provide early on a sense of safety and connection, being able to provide, I think of mental health care, substance abuse care, it's not easy to get access to those things. So then you have, again, people that are traumatized that don't have the tools to nurture and love. And so, there's just so many layers. But how great if we could focus in early on.
Like in an ideal world, I presume you would want just open access to like mental health care, right?
Right.
That's not this world right now, at least for quite a while. Like what changes do you think would be like actionable that you could see either just in mental health or like in the judicial system where you're like, this one small change could make like a huge difference?
Geez, I don't know, because there's just such a big financial piece to it.
Like, is that like the main thing is just like access due to like cost?
Yeah, even with just Medicaid in the organization I work with, the last, 6 months, with Medicaid before, you always have to demonstrate there's a medical necessity, right? Just for substance use. And we primarily work with substance use when it comes to Medicaid. We just went through the process to get approved to provide mental health care with people who have Medicaid. And so but we've had so many people that they go and audit and they say, well, this person doesn't need treatment. They've been here for 2 years, but recovery just doesn't work that way. And so now we have people losing Medicaid. They don't have any other insurance. And so how do we say, well, you're done? When, as it is, again, like you said, these people are being forced to, court mandated. So it takes quite a while before they realize, oh, I want this for myself. This is such a benefit. Sometimes it takes a good year in. And now you have to be licensed, which is great. I think that's wonderful that there's more accountability. But when you have somebody who's been working with somebody who's primarily substance abuse and now they have mental health, because they often go hand in hand, but to say you don't meet criteria for substance use disorder, so you can't work with that clinician anymore. It's just...
Yeah, it's just kind of overall a mess.
It really is. And it's just how can we just get people services?
Yes.
Even if it's, 60 days before we transition, and just to find somebody. We were in the last year able to, now we can provide what we call a safety net, for people with mental health, instead of just, well, we can't work with them, it's out of our scope of practice. We can now at least provide temporary services.
Until they can
get into somebody. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you.
I'm so sorry.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Kelby.
My apologies.
Man, what was I going to say? Oh, so I've never asked somebody in your field about this, and I've always been kind of curious. What do you think of like the kind of appification of like mental health, like the, sign up for an app, shop around to get the therapist that fits for you, like pay a monthly, like, like your Netflix payment to like talk to your therapist once a month. Like, how does that, does that feel icky? It feels really icky to me. It just feels so weird. I would never want to share like that with somebody like over the phone. And that's probably just because I'm ancient, right? But but it just seems really weird. Like, how do, I guess you, or maybe just your profession in general, if you don't want to be very specific about it, like, how is that viewed, I guess?
That's such a good question. I don't think it comes up, to be honest.
Which
I would like to talk about that.
Way more icky to me, just so you know.
Yes, well, I would like to talk about that with even just like the people that are just graduating.
Yeah.
I do think, on the one hand, I think it also allows for some of the younger people, to access mental health. They're so into that. And I think at the very least, at least it's something they're reaching out, because in my 20s, early 20s, that wasn't even on my radar.
Oh, yeah.
And it felt crazy when somebody's like, well, why don't you take some pills? Or why are you so anxious? And now I think it's a little more normalized. We talk about it. So on that hand, I think it gives more access, but I don't know how effective it is. Because even when we do telehealth now, when the pandemic hit, we went from in-person to sometimes phone calls. Mm-hmm. And I hated that, because then people are just doing all kinds of stuff. I asked people, like, what are you doing? And like, oh, I'm working out. I'm like, well, how can you really focus when you're working out? So even that, and we're moving away just now after 6 years away from telephone calls, and it has to be on Google Meet. We have to be able to see you, and to be able to work with you.
Sorry.
So
No.
being seen. So I think it makes it easier. So I don't know. I haven't had any experience, and I don't know anybody personally who's used that on an app. I know we do call to text. If you're in a crisis, here's a text. Text them, but that even seems weird.
I honestly don't think I know anybody that's used it either. Like, I just see it like it's like advertising fodder on like YouTube and stuff. Like, it's the same level as like Factor meals or Bombas socks, where I'm just like, would I trust that? I don't know. It seems weird. I don't know. it just popped in my brain. Sorry. So just kind of to pull it around into like a more like a neater bow. You're talking about community and like connections, and you're talking about, really being able to like open up to people and, create those spaces. Not all of us obviously deal with people having mental health crises or substance abuse problems, but like those feel like good things all the time, right? So what is like a practical piece of advice that you would give to somebody about how to like kind of create those new connections with people just like in their day-to-day lives?
Well, and I feel like I might be the worst, because at work it's a challenge. I have to make sure I leave my door open and people come in and be accessible. So I feel like it's easy for me to talk about and encourage everybody to find a way to connect. For me, it's a challenge personally. So I think sometimes it's just, I think getting out, making eye contact with people and smiling, that for me, for somebody who's so introverted and so anxious about the world, that has been helpful for just in life. I made an intention. I once got this compliment when I was in college and I was walking across the campus, and for my whole life, I got this feedback. People would say, why don't you smile more? And I never did, but a stranger approached me once and said, hey, I've got a smile in my pocket if you'd like it. And I was so annoyed, because I'm like, why do I keep getting this feedback? So I was just done. And so I was very intentional from that day forward, and even now, to make eye contact, to smile with people that I don't know, strangers I don't know. And I think that in itself has been helpful, because it reminds us we're not alone. We're constantly around people. I think it's really easy to get in your head, to go to the store and, have pods in your ear, something else in your ear, and you just miss out on everything. Yeah. And again, I tell people it's mindlessness. We're not fully tuned into what's going on around us. And I think that is important, just to remember we're not alone. Like, walk out and say hello to a neighbor and eye contact.
It's interesting the like dichotomy of like mindfulness versus mindlessness, right? Like this idea that as soon as you like kind of detach, like you're just going through it and you're not experiencing really anything. Like we don't realize that I think we don't realize like how much information like our brains are actually like taking in. But if we're not paying attention, if we're not like focused on like the moment or what's happening around us, it just like all dissipates, kind of like our nose, right? Mm-hmm. We're not thinking about it, so we don't see it, but it is there like in our field of vision, right? So yeah. It's like that, it's that same kind of thing that if you're not thinking through your day, if you're not thinking through this moment, then you're just kind of ignoring all of it, even no matter how half-assed you think you're concentrating on your day-to-day life. So Oh no, I think that's really important. David talked about that quite a bit too, I think, which is, it's interesting to see like kind of both sides of this equation, like having the conversations with both of you, like him talking about like receiving the information of, you know, substance abuse stuff, and you like delivering the information, and seeing like how those two things work together. It's really, really neat to me. I'm glad I talked. But I don't know. I guess to wrap up, is there anything that you would like really want people to like understand? Like, you know, what is the thing, you know, about this conversation about yourself that you just feel like this is very important, and it's kind of like the key to what I'm thinking about right now? Like, how would you sum it all up?
Well, and the thing I tell everybody too is the more I think we tune into ourselves, and tune into what's going on, because, you know, 80%, we take in about 80% information. We have this nerve, I always talk about the vagus nerve, one of the biggest nerves or the longest nerves in our body. It's taking like 85% information from our senses up into our brain. And sometimes it's unconscious. And so how we think and how we act and how we treat people, sometimes I think is on an unconscious level, because we're not tuning in to anything. And so I think tuning into yourself, what's going on with me, and going back to that cognitive behavioral base, if I can know what's happening to me and what I'm thinking about and how I'm feeling, then I can change my responses to the world around me, and really be in tune with how am I responding to the world around me? What has shaped that? What's contributed to that? And maybe I can let my guard down a little bit, connect more. Because I really do think there's so much uncertainty and fear in the world. And I think people do really feel alone and scared of what does this mean for my future. And so I think if we can tune into that, and I'm all about compassion, but I think it would help us to be a little more compassionate, not just to ourselves, but to people around us. And again, to get curious instead of so judgmental.
That's awesome. Like, it's interesting to think about, like, connecting with yourself basically helps you connect with others. Mm-hmm. Like, understanding yourself helps you understand others. Like, you know, I think there's a lot of moments where I have that in my life where I'm just like, when I was less mature, when I understood myself less fully, I had these preconceived notions about like all these groups of people. But now I've experienced all these different aspects of life and different groups and things like that, and you end up coming to the conclusion that with rare exception, people are just trying to not be horrible to each other and survive. Mm-hmm. You know,
yeah.
Except for like a very thin minority of people that are absolute asswipes. So that's true. But yeah. Anyway, yeah. So thank you for hanging out with me and talking for a while. I have no idea how long we've gotten. So
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
I really appreciate it. Like, I think having these kind of conversations are really important, because so much of like what we see like on our, you know, on YouTube and on television and stuff, it's just people being contentious with each other. And I even think with like people that I disagree with, it'd be really important to have like conversations like this, because there's so much more like common space and middle ground than anybody gives anyone credit for. So I've been really enjoying doing these things, and talking with smart people is kind of fun. So thanks for being on.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for watching. If you stuck around this long, you're here for some reason. I mean, appreciate it. Be sure to do the things, the liking and subscribing and all that stuff, especially if you made it this long. Jesus, right? Like, if you made it this long, for real. Today was bummer. It really felt bummer. Like, I think the world is kind of bummer sometimes. But with that in mind, I want to talk about what the next episode will be. And it will be two things. It will be a like 10 bands that I have randomly been introduced to, either through like my kids or the algorithm or whatever, that give me tons and tons of hope. And then I'm trying to convince my wife to sit down and do an interview so that I can get her to talk about her real passion, which is spreadsheets. No, just kidding. It's roller derby. So And that, I think, would be a much more heartwarming and uplifting episode, because I love laughing with my wife. Anyway, yeah. Till next time, I'm not really an interesting guy. I'm just interested in interesting things. And if I hated you, you would know.